email your nomination to yourself. It is Porter at eporter@kbbg.org. That's EPORTER@kbbg.org. Fax it to 319-234-6182.
Yeah. We have another studio that signs on the other side of the building. I'll take you around the building for you. Yeah, we should have. I have scheduled a half an hour unless things are really going well. I can do pretty much as much time as I want. I just completed a 5-year strategic plan for this station, so I serve as a consultant to.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, I serve as a consultant to the station for management, and I've been on air for about 15 years and doing some national things. So this will be my home when I retire. I'll go straight into.
You'll still do.
I'll go straight into radio.
3, 2, 1.
Good morning. Welcome to For Your Information. My name is Scharron Clayton, and I'm broadcasting, of course, from KBBG radio station in Waterloo, Iowa. And this morning, we are quite pleased to have a very special guest with us, and I will be in conversation with my special guest. I'll let her introduce herself very briefly.
Thank you, Scharron. My name is Daisy Hernandez, and I am a writer and a journalist and a teacher. I am the co-editor of an anthology called Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Feminism. I was an editor for many years at a wonderful magazine on race and politics and the arts called Color Lines Magazine. It's on colorlines.com. And I have a book coming out in the fall called A Cup of Water Under My Bed by Beacon Press. That's about growing up Latina and issues of gender and sexuality, race and class. And I am going to be at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the fall teaching creative writing.
Okay, so she gave me many, many things that I could even kind of follow up on. But let me ask the question in this way. With that background, it's quite extensive. What specifically about your background would you like our listeners to be most aware of?
That's a wonderful question, Scharron. Thank you. I do have quite a background, I guess. I didn't think about it
What's
that way.
a wonderful background, you know, and I'm not denigrating it, but let's see if we can see who is this Daisy Hernandez who will be speaking at the University of Northern Iowa tonight.
I think the main thread in all of my work is a really deep fascination with the intersection of personal lives and public events. So that was true with my book Colonize This, which is a collection of personal essays by young women of color about feminism and about their experiences as young women of color. And so they really sort of talked in all of those, it was about 28 women that we have in the book, talked about sort of the places in their own lives where feminist theory that they were perhaps studying, how they were actually seeing that play out in their own lives, challenges that they were having. That was also true of my work at Color Lines as well. A lot of what we covered when I was there was, you know, what you were seeing in the main news, perhaps what you were seeing in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but we were looking at how are these issues affecting communities of color. And that's true of my upcoming book as well. It's a memoir, so it's about my own experience, but it's really focusing on sort of, okay, in the news you probably hear this about immigration, here's my family story about this, or you hear this about issues of class and race, and here's sort of my mother's story about that, or my father's story or something.
I'm really glad, and we'll come back to some of the other topics, but you mentioned the memoir, and I'm really happy that you did that because you have a way of presenting the movement of people telling their stories and creating narratives from the 50s and the 60s, the civil rights era, through hip-hop, through now we're in this period that you have labeled as the writing of memoir. So I'm really pleased that you mentioned that. I'd like to know more. But first I'd like to know, in interviewing these 28 people that you talked to, young women, was there anything remarkable that stands out? And I'm sure that the stories were all remarkable, but what might you have learned from interviewing these young women? Because I do know in the 50s and 60s, the use of the language of feminism in communities of color was not a very welcome ideology because of the exclusion and exclusionary nature feminism and women of color. So what with these young women, and how do we understand this gravitation back towards this particular ideology?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'll clarify and say that I didn't interview them. I actually edited the book, so they.
Okay.
So what we did was we put out the word, because this was before social media. So
Right.
we sent out emails, and they submitted. So it was 28 essays that we ended up choosing out of over 200 submissions from young women of color across the country. And I did work very closely with them, so I kind of did do interviews because I worked very, very closely on revising their essays with them. And I would say that the main thread, there were definitely stories of feeling excluded from feminism. There were a lot of stories. One of the threads that I would say was that, they didn't necessarily grow, we didn't necessarily, I include myself in this, we didn't necessarily grow up hearing the word feminism in relationship to ourselves and our communities. And a lot of times we came into contact either through activism or through a women's studies course. And it opened up something for us, and we took ownership of it as well. But the other thing that I would mention is that a lot of the women wrote about their mothers, a lot. Like, we have one section that's just devoted to mothers in the book, but it really could have been the entire book, could have been about their mothers or their aunties, these sort of women who were very much themselves coming of age in the 50s and 60s, who had been really powerful figures in their lives and had really embodied what these young women perhaps came to define as feminism, and were really critical in informing their ideas of what it means to be a feminist of color in this country. So that was, I would say, one really powerful.
So it sounds like these young women, may I ask the age range of the women? Do you know their ages, or like, was it 15 to 25? Or?
I would say mostly in their 20s, and at the time I did it, this was 12 years ago.
Yeah,
I was 25 myself.
Okay.
It was the babies leading the babies.
I was going to say. So in reading this, though, 12 years ago, you still found that there was some skepticism on the part of the 25 or the 20-year-old population regarding feminism. But was it that they weren't recognizing what feminism was all about, or?
All of the women identified as feminist. The experience that they had that was, I would say, common overall, was that they would end up in Women's Studies 101 or a more advanced Women's Studies class, and they would be the only women of color in the class. There's a wonderful writer in the book who talks about, oh gosh, now we're at the part in the semester where the white girls cry about something. And so that was sort of a very common experience. And it's 12 years later, and I was just at a school last week talking with a student who had just read the book for the first time and related so deeply to that experience of being the one or two girls of color in the classroom and feeling like we're going to go through this white guilt about race, we're going to cry about it. And meanwhile, they're sitting in the class going, okay, we're just waiting for this sort of white guilt thing to pass.
Did these young women of color feel pressed upon to represent all of the women of color, as if it would be embodied in one particular person? Did they feel that press? These students that you were talking to? Absolutely.
I think that was one of the joys of working on the book for me as an editor, and I think for them also individually as writers, is that, and I'll talk about this tonight during my talk about, correcting this blame game, or correcting sort of these ideas that people push on us and expect us to teach everyone perhaps about race. I think it was amazing and liberating for them to write their own stories and to voice their own experiences, and then to be part, not to do that in sort of an isolated way, like maybe one article in one newspaper at one point in time, but to actually be part of a book. Yeah. And I think books create amazing types of communities. And so it was also speaking and they were all speaking to each other. And
it's important that those stories are told. I know there's research on reducing prejudice. And one of the most profound ways to do that is through reading personal stories, as opposed to having speakers, as opposed to reading just academic books. It's the reading of the personal narrative that has the greatest impact on reducing prejudice in people. So I think the book is probably doing its work, in terms of how people are looking at feminism. But as I talk and listen to you regarding the importance of mothers and aunts and extended families, I'm wondering whether any of these women had any commentary on the role of men in their particular narratives that they wrote.
Yeah, I think that was also one of the reasons that I was excited about working on the book as well, is that one of the things that I noticed both in women's studies and also in activism when I was in college, in terms of my feminist activism, was that I noticed in my white peers there was sort of the man was the problem. But in my own home, and I grew up with a very patriarchal, what we call machista father, and he had a lot of power inside of our home. However, the minute we stepped outside of our home, he only spoke Spanish. So I, as the bilingual speaker, always had a lot of power. So I grew up very, very clear that the men in our lives were very vulnerable in certain ways, and we're not sort of these power monsters.
Right.
And then, so I...
Excuse me, because when he had to interact outside of his realm, when he had to interact within the environment that actually marginalized the Latino population, he seemed to take then that, what's that word, the role of not being as powerful as a means of survival. So he was flipping the script in terms of, okay, I'm sorry, it was just interesting.
Oh, absolutely,
you know,
absolutely.
It was a survival strategy.
Absolutely, I would go with him. So he worked in both my parents worked in factories all their lives, and we were very much impacted by NAFTA, which is a treaty between here and Mexico and Canada that really sort of changed our economy here and in other countries as well. And so I would go with him to the unemployment agency, and I was his spokesperson at the unemployment agency. And it would very much bring up frustration on his part about the fact that he couldn't communicate in his own language. Agency workers, of course, were also expecting me to be the translator, and they would get frustrated with me as well if they weren't getting the information that they wanted. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I was his. I was very much spokesperson. Is sort of the best word that I can think of.
I want to pick up on that because you have a sensitivity for the men in society. You know, it's not like a bashing. Feminism is not like bashing men, so to speak, because there are roles that are played. I'm wondering how you look at feminism and womanism, you know, in terms of similarly fixed movements for equality, but one being a bit academically defined as being broader than the other. Have you worked at all with that kind of thinking?
I have. I've met a lot of women of color who really feel comfortable with the word womanist and really embrace that. You know, it wasn't a part of my experience. I came into feminism only knowing the word feminist, and I took to it like the fish in the water and really embraced it. I think that there's room for embracing, identifying ourselves in all sorts of ways. I think that sometimes the word feminist for me is a little bit less important than what it actually means for me, which is sometimes not even so much the equality between genders or sexes, but the intersections of women and men's lives, and the idea that, you know, as women's lives improve and get better, naturally so do men's as well, right? So that's sort of how I look at
it's like when and where I enter, then the whole community will enter with me.
Absolutely. I like to see, my feminism, you know, the word that, and I'll talk about this tonight as well, the word that I really like to use with feminism is community. Sometimes we hear the word feminist and it has sort of a solitary reputation. Like, are you a feminist? As though you're the only one. You know, and womanist as well. Are you a womanist? As though you might be the only one on the planet.
Yeah, it seems like that's a consequence of not understanding. You know, feminism can, as you know, be viewed on a continuum in terms of expressions, you know. And I think people got locked into the far-right expression of feminism back in the 50s and 60s. So broadening it to community. If you broaden it to community, then I see that there is the overlay with the two ideologies, because that's what a womanist is basically, is a community-oriented, at least this is my understanding. I ask that because, of course, in my classes, when I teach my Black women's course, some of the folks, the guys particularly, are anti-feminist language because they're still stuck in the 50s and 60s, one definition, not understanding the varieties of ways that you can look at feminism, with equality being at the core, and not understanding the conflict, philosophical conflict between having a movement for equality that would only look at the equality of one person. Those two things just don't fit. So I wanted to see, if I'm hearing you right, you see feminism as a move towards equality for a community that would of necessity have to include the women working such that the community can follow. When you free the women, then you have empowered the entire community. Have I stretched that too much?
No, I think you're right. I think that also there are so many things that happen right now in our country that we tend to not view as being feminism or part of our community. So when we turn on the news and we hear another case of racial profiling, we tend to not think about that as having anything to do with feminism. And I find that always so strange, because that was someone's brother or someone's son or some, and it affects a whole community when our men are being profiled, for example. With deportations, it's the same thing.
Right.
There's entire immigrant families that are affected when one person is deported, or when the men are deported, for example. And so my feminism broadens in that sense. And that's sort of what I mean with community.
With that thinking, it appears as if we have been then impacted tremendously with a Western way of thinking, in dichotomous ways, and binary ways, that it's either white or black, good or bad, male or female, and we haven't been able to move from that kind of imperialistic conditioning of our minds to think that we can only think in these two categories, and that has an impact on race, class, gender, and sexuality when we only have two. It's like we're simple-minded people, that we can only think two things at a time, and we can't go beyond that, which really restricts the forward movement of a whole society, of an entire society, when you have been impacted by Western ways of thinking and reasoning. It's totally incredible. Now, I see that it's 1:45. We have about 15 or 14 minutes. I want to make sure, you mentioned a couple of things that you're going to talk about tonight at the Curris Business Building at the University of Northern Iowa at 7 o'clock, room 109. The title that I have for that is Feminist Compadres?
Comadres.
Yeah, okay, I wrote that wrong. And maybe Beyonce?
Maybe Beyonce.
Okay, Models of Leadership. Why this title?
Well, I'm definitely going to talk about feminism.
Okay, it sounds like we got that one covered.
I'm going to talk about women's leadership and language, and so I want to break down, the words and the associations that we have with feminism, and some of the other associations that we could have, like community. The word comadre in Spanish means,
Why did I write it down like this?
Compadre would be the male.
I know.
You're very close.
I guess I'm influenced. Go ahead.
Yeah, and comadre meaning, your best friend, as I like to translate it, your best friend forever. Literally in the Latino community means the woman you ask to be the godmother to your children.
Okay.
And there's some negative connotations sometimes in Spanish, but I have very much reclaimed the word to mean a very close friend. It seems as though you have a habit of changing meanings to suit your pleasure. Okay. Yes.
No,
that might be a pattern of my history.
I mean that in not in a negative way, but that's what oppressed people do. When there's a negativity associated with some way of description, then we have a tendency to co-opt it, change it, make it so that it doesn't have the same power. Absolutely. And I would like our listeners to know that I wasn't really insulting my guest, Daisy Hernandez, who's speaking tonight. And once again, you're listening to KBBG radio station, broadcasting from Waterloo, Iowa. And if you are listening via the internet, do remember that we always communicate to educate. You can click on and have your friends click on kbbg.org and tune in and have them tune in. And if you're listening, I must do this, remember, any time is the right time to support this public radio station that depends on public support so that we can interview wonderful people like Daisy Hernandez. Now, I've been asking you these questions. What would you like to say to our listeners about your speech tonight or your book that's coming out?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I don't feel like I said that at the beginning. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I think what I would love to say about my talk tonight, and it's also true about my book, is that a lot of my passion is about the intersection, as I said, of women and men's lives, and really broadening the ideas that we have about feminism. And also, as you talked about actually earlier, the importance of personal narratives. I completely agree that personal narratives have a way of touching people and helping them to understand themselves better. And when I worked on Colonize This, I didn't think too much about who our audience would be. It was all young women of color. We were young women of color at that point, learning ourselves. And I've gone across the country with that book, and I've seen it touch people from all types of communities. It's been really amazing. I've had women who I just met somebody who created a student position for herself at an organization at college after reading the book. Another woman who said, this helped me to understand my relationship with my mother so much. And that's part of my work with the memoir that's coming out in the fall as well, is that I felt like people hearing directly from somebody who's a child of immigrant parents, who's grown up in a home with mixed immigration status. I identify as bisexual, and I'm very out as a bisexual, so I talk about being a queer woman of color. I thought it was important for people to hear those personal narratives to change their ideas about sort of the conceptions that they might have about our communities.
You know, you're so capable of getting so much information in such a short period of time. I love it. I absolutely love it.
My journalism background kicking
in.
It
does. It's kicking in for sure. You mentioned also that you will be teaching next year at Chapel Hill. What courses will you be teaching here?
I will. I will be teaching Introduction to Creative Writing. So I will be very much teaching how do we create these narratives that develop characters. Even when we're writing nonfiction, we're developing ourselves as a character on the page. I will be introducing, hopefully, undergraduates to a lot of writers of color, which is just a real passion of mine to be able to take both women and male authors into the classroom. And I'll be hopefully working on my second book as well, doing research for that there.
This second book, are you at a point where you can say the major thing that you're researching?
Yes, it's a book about a tropical disease called the Kiss of Death, which might sound like a departure from all of my work, except that it's not, because it's a neglected disease in Latin America that mostly afflicts poor people. It's very much a disease that, in a lot of ways, could be eradicated if we collectively made decisions about how to spend public health resources and money. And there are many people in the U.S. who are now afflicted by this as well, because immigrants are here, because there's more migration with Americans going to Latin America as well. I had an auntie who had suffered from this disease, and so that's sort of the personal narrative into this larger public conversation.
Well, I'm certainly going to be looking for your writing. In fact, I'm trying to get some of the older essays that you have written. I've been intrigued by the titles. And I was a bit surprised that when I tried to print things off about you, I don't know if they have you flagged in the system, but it wouldn't print. I couldn't print anything. I said, what is it? You know, I know I'm being watched for things, but anyhow, if you had...
I will get you a little packet of my essays.
If you had a invitation to give a message of guidance to a higher education administrative team regarding the lives of women of color on their campuses, what might you tell them, or how might you inform them about the lives of those women and how they could actually improve or create environments based on all that you know? You know, no holds barred, you know, you have no money restrictions or anything. What would you say to these administrators who invite people of color to their campus under the guise of diversity, so much so that white folks think that diversity means race, okay? It blows my mind. But they invite people to, it's like inviting someone to your home and then telling them that they can't come in with this on, they can't sit here, they can't do that. What would you tell these administrators?
That's a wonderful proposition. I love it. I think that the changes that I've seen, and I've been to a lot of different colleges over the last 10 years, I was realizing, talking about this book and about my work at Color Lines as well, I think that there has to be a really deep investment in hiring administrators of color, hiring administrators from different backgrounds, as you were saying, not only about race. I think that there also has to be a commitment to faculty who are have different life experiences. I always hesitate with the word diversity because I think it can be such a feel-good type of word.
It is, yeah,
but I think we need faculty and administrators who are both multiracial and who have also had, sort of a wealth of life experiences, who have themselves been first-generation college students and know what that's like, who have a variety of class experiences or experiences with immigration, for example, or sexuality. Because I think it's really important as a student, as a young person, to see these people in those positions, in that leadership position, to have that kind of support. And as we know, it makes a huge impact then in sort of what courses are funded, what speakers are brought in when they are brought in. It just has such a rippling effect. And I've seen that as well. You know, I have about 10 years of experience in journalism, and it's the same thing. A lot of times we focus on how can we get more writers of color published. But we can't make those moves if we don't have gatekeepers who also have an investment in opening up those doors, and if we don't completely change the institution. I think that's ultimately what the challenge is, that institutions move very, very slowly.
Very slow. And education is one of the slowest moving institutions. So in order to really impact change, we're creating environments that are welcoming and supportive and nurturing for students of color, women of color, varying sexualities, etc. There has to be leadership from the top. And so your recommendation would be to enhance the representation of all of the various differences, categories of differences in your administration and your faculty. And as an administrator, I might say to you, Daisy, that's a wonderful idea, but really, they're just not out there. That's just a wonderful idea, Daisy. So how do we get these people, Daisy?
Yeah, it does require that you go and look, because they are out there. They are very much out there, and I think that's. But I do recognize that is a long time in experience, and I think a long-held belief more than anything else that we don't exist out there. But it does require, I think a lot of times, and I don't know if this has been your experience. A lot of times, the hiring process, we go into that social circle or that professional network that we're already a part of, and if that is not multiracial, if that does not reflect, various experiences. People say, well, it doesn't exist.
We don't exist out there. That's the nature of prejudice. Birds of a feather flock together. And so likes choose likes. I know I've gotten you way off topic, but I'm very curious about, and I will talk with you more, luckily, tomorrow, about your ideas regarding a post-racial society, about your ideas of social justice based on sexuality, based on race, class and gender. Hopefully we'll have that conversation in my class tomorrow. I've been negligent here. I have a colleague sitting very patiently, and I'm wondering, after listening to this conversation, Dr. Logan, would you like to make any last comments?
Actually, I have a question. We hear this term women of color or even people of color, and recognizing that, we have it's the same struggle but difference, so to speak. So as far as coalition building across communities of color, what recommendations, what have you seen in your experience for forming alliances?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And when I worked at Color Lines magazine does reflect communities of color, and that was something that I had to keep in mind as an editor as I was assigning stories and working with writers, to make sure that we didn't conflate things, so that we were never saying, for example, the African American experience is exactly like the Latino experience. But I think there's something really powerful when we look at what do we actually have in common, and focus on those without denying that there are differences at the same time, if that makes sense.
Okay, as an older person, I'm going to say one thing. I was very much against using the phrase people of color or women of color, because in my thinking as an older person here at this table, it tended to ignore the specificity of problems of various people who would be in that group. And so that's another conversation. You're welcome to come to my class at 11 tomorrow, right 8. But tonight, I've been talking with Daisy Hernandez, who will be speaking at the University of Northern Iowa, 7 o'clock this evening, the Curris Business Building, room 109. Do come out and enjoy listening to the ideas of this young woman. She has very, very extensive background and much to put on the table. I'm sure she's been, I guess, referred to as writing a striking and illuminating memoir of stark beauty that challenges our notions of identity and feminine powers. Absolutely riveting and unforgettable. Thank you for being with us today. And I want to thank our listeners for being there. And until the next time, signing off. This is Scharron Clayton.
I don't know if I can make it tomorrow. What's not, like, what's your issue? But and I hear that because what is it? She has a blog on Native American children's literature, and that is one of the things. Debbie Reese, people of color. That is one of the things that she critiques the use of people of color, especially when it comes to Native populations, because what makes her point is that what makes Native populations different from those of African ancestry, those from the Caribbean, those from Latin or Central America, or what have you, or North America, Mexico, being that Natives have dual citizenship and the other groups